Hello and welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Real Canadian Liberal podcast, where we look at fresh haircuts and 5 o'clock shadow. Or better yet, this look at the world from a liberal lens. A real liberal lens. I'm talking about Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, a little bit of Abraham Lincoln type lens. Not that collectivist, neo-fascist, corporatist nonsense that masquerades as liberalism these days. People call it modern liberalism, but that's incorrect. It just isn't liberalism. It's the most illiberal ideology on earth, it would seem, at the moment. And so we're going to look at something a little bit different today. Two guys that I greatly admire. I really enjoy their work. Don't agree with them on everything, but I enjoy listening to them, are Douglas Murray and Dr. Jordan Peterson. And they had a discussion back in, I think it was about the end of January. And they got into the American election and what was happening with political movements and sectors of American society and what was happening and that kind of stuff. And they came to a couple of statements and conclusions that told me that they'd badly misjudged what was happening in the U.S. Politically or philosophically. And they'd mixed up, as many people do, the who is who in terms of the sides in American politics, if you want to call them sides, the main camps. Let's put it that way. And I find this rather interesting because Dr. Peterson's done a lot of the research on the personality aspects of political orientation and political instincts, and if he, I think, if he spent a little bit more time looking at his own research, he'd have a completely different view of American politics, particularly over the last few years. So, before I start off, what I want to do is I want to bring your attention to something here. We're going to go to the website that this podcast is supposed to be based on. We haven't got to it much yet, but I'd just like you to be able to reference this when I talk about this subject, because it's here, and we're looking at realcanadianliberal.ca / what is the political spectrum. There's a bunch of other articles there, and I've got a few more in draft form to put up. But anyway, that's the one that we need to look at for this podcast. And it looks at the political spectrum from a modern contemporary understanding of it, and a perhaps a more traditional or more accurate Enlightenment viewpoint, and finding out what is the real political spectrum and what does it actually mean. Anyway, there's lots of references there. There's a few definitions and bits and bobs, but we'll come back to that in a second. What I want to do first is I want to introduce you to a short segment of the discussion between Dr. Peterson and Douglas Murray, and then unpack a little bit of it and unpack some of the assumptions that are being made in the conversation that I think are fundamentally incorrect, and I think are feeding part of the misunderstanding of politics across the West, but in particular in the U.S. at the moment, because we've got people who don't really understand the philosophical foundations behind some of the movements we're dealing with, and I think we really need to, because they've got a bad history of coming out and biting us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the podcast itself, and I'll just play this short segment, and then I'll chat about it once we've done that.
Let me offer something that might be an analog to that, maybe. And this might also be viewed by listeners or viewers as concentrating on rearranging the deck chairs when the ship is sinking. But in any case, last week the Biden-Harris organization put out a tweet with a little video, and it was Joseph Biden discussing what he was going to do to small business owners that had been decimated by this terrible pandemic. And then he listed all the identity politics groups that would be preferentially treated. Now, I watched that and I thought that was a big mistake. He could have, because he's at the height of his ability to set his own agenda and not to pander to the radicals on the left. If he can't do it right now, he's never going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
He should have said, people have been devastated by this pandemic. Small business owners, we're going to do everything we can to help them, starting with those who have been affected the most, which is a perfectly reasonable place to start. But he had to list Asians, Latinos, women, people of color. He may not have listed that particular category, certainly blacks. And it seemed to me to be completely superfluous. And one of those small slips of the sort that you're describing that lead to this positive feedback loop.
Exactly. I saw that video as well. I was horrified. I thought, if you're the incoming president, you won the election, you have the most important opportunity now to help heal America, and you're pulling this.
Well, and you also have something obvious to do in front of you. All Biden has to do, there's nothing he has to do except immunize the population as fast as possible. It's like he's got the clearest mandate of any president that I can remember, because the problem is self-evident. It's like the pandemic is terrible. It's killing people and it's driving them crazy.
Well, that's absolutely. I mean, we should get on that. This is one of my other big fears, that the era of the pandemic. It's the worst possible time to have an overarching conspiracy narrative introduced to the system by the American president. I mean, the outgoing American president. It's a very bad time.
That is for sure.
Donald J. Trump must know this. It's one of the fears that conservatives always had about him, was that he was going to pull some crap like this at the end. You know, it was one of the reasons why a lot of good people wouldn't join the administration, why they wanted to keep a million miles away from him. And this is a very, very dangerous and reprehensible thing for him to have done in recent years.
Yes, well, you can see his essential narcissism manifest itself.
Absolutely.
And like, it seems to me quite likely that that 75% of Trump believes what he's saying, can't conceive of the fact that he lost the election, and I mean, maybe that's not relevant, although I think I'm always trying to understand him from a psychological perspective. But I think his narcissism is so great that he's willing to risk. It appears that he's willing to risk everything in order to maintain his belief in victory.
Yes, including the Republic, and including all conservative voters, and yes, and more importantly, the Republic. I think it's completely reprehensible, and I know there will be people watching who support Trump and will be furious. I still think it's very, very.
Well, look, we already walked through why supporting Trump at the moment is something that needs to be rethought.
Absolutely.
And I want to get back to that just for one moment. Look, the problem is that if you want to maintain your support for Trump under the current conditions, that you're going to make yourself a lot more politically radical than you were last week, because you have to swallow so much more than you did 2 weeks ago, say, or 3 weeks ago.
You have to believe that absolutely every institution in American life is totally corrupted, and that the only uncorrupted thing is Donald J. Trump.
Right, and both of those, like each of those things is not true, and the combination of them is even less true.
Yes. So it's very, very important that people realize that Donald Trump was in a society that was very close already to conflagration. And he started playing with the matchbox in a very dangerous way from the moment of the evening of the election, when he said that he thought he'd won it already. And his insistence that he has won it still to this moment is a deeply corrupting influence on all of American politics, and it's going to do enormous damage to everyone on the right of politics everywhere in the world for the foreseeable future. So I think it was reprehensible what he did. However, I add this to the fact that we're already in this era. I mean, since we last spoke, Jordan, when we last spoke, if either of us had said to the other that the citizenry of all of our countries will be confined to our houses throughout 2020 and 2021, and made not to see our friends and our closest family in many cases, and not to be allowed to go to the funerals of loved ones, and much, much more, and that just basic things like shopping for essential goods would become problematic. If either of us had said this to the other one when we last spoke, we would wouldn't be able to foresee the circumstances in which such a horror show occurred. We've been in the middle of this horror show. We're still in it in our respective countries. And so again, we already have a very dangerous situation occurring where we are all even more in our solitudes than the social media systems have already made us. We've already lost almost all of our remaining social antennae. We don't have the ability to feel exactly what it is in a normal situation, like down the pub or talking with friends in a normal situation over a cup of coffee. We've lost all of that in the last 8 months. So it's a very bad idea.
There's nowhere that isn't a catastrophe. And so it's very easy to believe that there's catastrophe everywhere, even where there isn't.
Because And in this situation, our most important duty, it seems to me, is to hold on as much as we can in this very, very choppy time and not fall into conspiratorial thinking or vengefulness or excuse of violence
or resentment.
Resentment, legitimization of extra political or non-political means, and much more. That's our job.
We could point out, that the Democrats are making a conservative argument with regards to the election. They're saying, look, the institutions worked. Therefore, we're the valid government. But before they can make the claim that they're the valid government, they have to accept the claim that the institutions worked. And the conservatives shouldn't object to that because the conservatives believe that the institutions are valid.
Okay. There's quite a lot to unpack there. Right. Where to start? Well, let's start right at the end there. Professor Peterson made the statement that the Democrats are making the conservative argument. The institutions worked. And yet, Douglas Murray just made that quite long statement just before that, talking about how we've been locked up and we've not done anything normal for over a year and all this kind of stuff. And I'd like to refer both of them, if possible, to an article written by Jeffrey A. Tucker, a good liberal of the classical sense, in the American Institute for Economic Research, published on the 19th of April this year, so that's yesterday. And the title of the article is "The Lockdown Paradigm is Collapsing." Now, I bring that up for a reason. Saying that the institutions worked to the sort of people who voted for Donald Trump is so self-evidently incorrect that it's hard to believe that it could be made by either of the two men talking in that conversation. Now, I understand Douglas Murray is very conservative, and he's like, oh, we just need to hold back and just not do anything too rash and everything else. A perfectly conservative instinct. But I'd just like to point something out to everyone, right? The people voting for Donald Trump aren't conservatives. They're referred to as conservatives in the United States because no one actually knows what a conservative is or what a liberal is, or what a socialist is, or what a revolutionary is. So I'm just going to go back to my website here for a second and highlight a thing. See, the political spectrum, and this was well known by James Madison and Jefferson and all those people. I ran across this when I was in the UK Staff College. But the axis of political motivation, a conservative and liberal are not two opposing ideas. Conservative isn't a political philosophy at all. Conservative is a personality trait. Pretty much nothing more, nothing less. It's just a personality trait. A conservative is someone who wants things to stay pretty much the way they are, because that's what they know and that's what they're comfortable with. And a revolutionary is the opposite of a conservative. They're one who wants to change things from what they are now to something else, whatever it happens to be. It doesn't matter what it happens to be, as long as they want to change it to get there as a revolutionary. And there's extremes on that. So our reactionaries and ultra-conservative, they're the ones who want to fight, and they'll be willing to do violence to keep everything the way they were, where they are now or recently were. And, radicals would be the extreme polar opposite of that. But that's the deal. That is a secondary axis of political motivation. The biggest axis of political motivation, and Zuby, the British rapper, says this quite well. It's simply this. It's the group of people who want to be left alone versus the bunch of people who refuse to leave them alone. Roughly speaking, liberals versus socialists. And I'll quickly define those. Liberals are people who believe that people have intrinsic human value and that society derives its value from the collection of the individuals within it. Socialists, on the other hand, various different varieties, are people who believe that humans have no intrinsic value and that their value is derived from the group or society around them. So, you have two axes of political motivation there, and there is actually a third. There's egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism, and sometimes they align with conservatism versus revolutionary, but not always. The point is this. The people who voted for Donald Trump are not conservatives. They are, many of them, known in the United States as constitutional conservatives, but that does not mean that they're a conservative. That means that they would like to conserve the American Republic as it is written down literally in the Constitution. But they're not conservatives, because that document, the American Constitution, and the American Bill of Rights, is effectively liberalism codified. The philosophy of liberalism, classical liberalism, and a little bit of French liberalism there, but predominantly from the English tradition of liberalism. And so, this is what Dr. Peterson missed, right? When he says that the Democrats are making the conservative argument. Trust the institutions, trust this, trust that. Trust government, trust what's happening, trust the elections, trust... Well, here's the point. That is the conservative argument because the Democrats are the conservatives in the United States. They're the ones who are standing up for the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy is big government, interventionist, close down all of society, New York lockdowns, California lockdowns, add in identity politics, rioting in the streets if you don't get your way, etc. That, ladies and gentlemen, is currently the orthodoxy in the United States and across the West, but in particular within the political elites and the academic elites. That's the orthodoxy. And the people who want to retain that are conservative. Not conservatives in the way that we talk about it in political sense, but they are very conservative. They want to retain that. Right? They want to retain and advance that identity politics, big government, interventionist, anti-human rights, anti-individualist orthodoxy. And I'll add to that. There's a book recently written by a Singaporean academic and diplomat. Can't pronounce his name, but anyway, it's called Has China Won? So Google it, look it up. Anyway, he's a very good author. Read that book. He's made a very, very good argument that if you look at the American political evolution, beginning roughly in the end of the 1970s, but really it took hold in the early 1990s. The United States is no longer a constitutional republic or a constitutional democracy in the sense that it was originally intended to be by its founding fathers. The United States is a plutocracy, is a plutocratic state. It is run predominantly by a political elite and a corporate elite combined. It is a plutocratic corporatist state. And the individual and small business doesn't seem to matter anymore, for the most part, except in that bit of America that's called flyover country, where all the Donald Trump voters come from. And they weren't voting for Donald Trump because he was like the quintessential classical liberal John Stuart Mill type. They voted for him because both mainstream American political parties are predominantly part of that plutocratic, elitist mob that has taken over since about 1990. And part of that has occurred. If you look at it and you don't believe me, have a look at this, right? How many American politicians prior to 1979 got wealthy or rich, filthy rich in some cases, by being a politician? And I think you'll find that none of them. Jimmy Carter didn't retire extremely rich. He wasn't bad off, but he was a former American president. He was never what I would call ridiculously rich. Now look at the American politics. There are lots of American politicians who supposedly earn, a nice six-figure salary, who have fortunes that are way beyond what that six-figure salary would build. Right? The Clintons are enormously wealthy. Obama, enormously wealthy. Whole plethora of them. The Bushes, enormously wealthy, although they did bring some wealth into politics with them. The point is, American politics, unfortunately, is dominated by extraordinarily wealthy, corporately connected political elites. And up until Trump, there was about a 30-year period where there was very little choice. Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. Well, big deal. Very little difference. Corporate elitist versus corporate elitist. Just slightly different leanings. Which one would prefer more government control over the corporatist state, and which one would prefer more corporatist control over the government? I mean, that's what it comes down to. Where does the balance of power lie? In the corporate headquarters, or does it lie in the government? Well, Mussolini didn't care. If you know it, go back to fascism. Fascism was the marriage between corporate and state power, as Mussolini said. It's probably said by Giovanni Gentile as well, who is kind of his philosopher of fascism. But it's corporatism. It's as old as the hills. It's the economic system that Adam Smith is railing about in the 1770s. And so this is the issue we've got, right? When you're talking about Trump voters, they're not conservatives. They don't want to conserve anything, right? Some of them are what we call constitutional conservatives. That would make them liberals, right, in the broad brush sense, because they believe in individual liberty, individual rights, small government. They believe that, and this is a historically verifiable fact, right, if government is not kept on a leash by the population, then its boot will be on the throats of the population. That's unfortunately the way where it goes, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the United States of America has become extraordinarily corrupt, particularly in the last 30 years. And Donald Trump was not the initiator of the movement that people call the Trump movement or whatever. He's just a response to it. It's not going anywhere. You could shoot Donald Trump tomorrow, and I'm not saying anyone should, right? What a disaster that would be. Could you imagine? Tear the whole world apart. But anyway, the point is Donald Trump could disappear tomorrow. He could jump in a space capsule with Elon Musk and they could go off to Mars to retire. And that movement would not stop. Someone else would rise to the top of it. Why? Because you've got a large proportion of the United States. Possibly a majority. We're not too sure. Right? Because let's face it, the American electoral system is highly suspect, I would say. When you're arguing about whether you should have voter ID, right? When most of the civilized world, including Africa and other places, all recognize the fact that voter ID is an essential part of any sort of sensible election system. It's just insane that would even be a topic of conversation. But anyway, the point is, the United States do not have as robust and trustworthy a democratic system as everyone would like to believe, including lots of Americans. But certainly from the outside, you look in and you go, all is not well in the United States of America. Their electoral system needs a lot of reform. And I'm not saying that the result didn't go to Biden. What I'm saying is they've got serious problems down there. And they've got serious problems in the fact that they have a government and a state apparatus that has far exceeded its authority under its own law. The rule of law, the idea of the rule of law is that everyone follows the law. The king. The Americans don't have a king, but the president, the executive, has to follow the law. The legislative branch of government has to follow the law. The judicial branch has to follow the law. Right? Everyone's under the law. It's called the rule of law. It's a tradition that goes back to England about 800 years ago is where it first started kicking off. They didn't quite get there initially, but it took a while. The United States of America is the only country on earth that was formed by classical liberals and formed under a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, and a Bill of Rights that codified the idea of a rule of law, i.e., the ultimate authority of government is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The ultimate authority of government. Right? It's not the president. It's not the Speaker of the House. It's not the Attorney General. None of that. And here's the thing. When you assume that the people voting for Donald Trump are conservatives, you get it wrong. They're not. They're mostly revolutionaries. Their instinct is revolution. Why? Because they don't want a big government, corporatist state. Because that is not what the American Constitution and not what the American Founding Fathers created. It got towards that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the Sherman antitrust legislation laws were brought in, and they broke up, what was it, Standard Oil or whoever it was. It was some big oil company that ran everything. I mean, they've had times in the past where all this power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a very few small group of elites, right? And that is antithetical to the American experiment. It's antithetical to classical liberalism. It's antithetical to the idea of a free market and a democratized economy. Any sort of centralization, it doesn't matter whether it's private sector or public sector, it's the same thing. Comes right down to it. The effect is identical. And so this is the thing where I think Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson got it wrong. The Democrats are the conservatives. They're the ones who are fighting to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is a overreaching, leftist, collectivist, identity politicking mainstream, fed by the media, fed by multiple activist groups, and it's corporatist. It's a plutocratic corporatist system. And there are a lot of Republicans in the mainstream Republican Party who are happy to go along with that because it brings money and wealth and power to those individuals. But that is all antithetical to the founding of the United States of America. The United States of America is fundamentally a liberal nation by its founding, and it's gone away from liberalism. Alan Dershowitz would be able to explain the constitutional side of that much better than I could. But he's a proper liberal. And this is the issue we've got. People need to understand that people voting for Trump are predominantly, in their instincts, in their political motivation, they're predominantly liberal. Real liberals, right? And I'm not saying that they don't have their do's and don'ts. They don't have their little boxes of what they think is right and wrong. But anyway, the point is they're predominantly liberal. They believe in individual autonomy. They don't want the government in their lives. They don't want the government determining who they marry and who they can't marry. They don't want the government determining when they can get up, when they can go out, how they can deal with their own health care, and all that kind of stuff. They want liberty, right? They want freedom of speech. They want to be able to defend themselves and look after themselves and run their own businesses. And they don't want corporate monopolies pushing the little guy out. They don't want lots of regulation that benefits the massive corporations and creates barriers to entry into different market sectors. They don't want industrial concentration in both the political and the economic sphere. They're liberals. And they voted for Donald Trump not because they're liberals, but they voted for Donald Trump because the mainstream isn't liberal and they are revolutionary and they want to break the mainstream. Quite literally, they hired him to take a sledgehammer to Washington. And you may not like that. You may think there's a better way of doing it. But wouldn't it be nice if there was? But do you see a truly liberal voice anywhere in the United States in politics? Don't know. Tulsi Gabbard might be, but she didn't get very far. On the Republican side, there are a few as well. Perhaps the Libertarian Party, they take it a little bit too far off the other end. But the point is, they have the liberals of the United States, which make up the whole of flyover country pretty much, as people call it. That middle America, the people where they work hard and want to be independent and everything else. Those people are liberals for the most part. They're not John Stuart Mill, but they are liberals. They want to be independent. They want to run their own lives. And they want their country to be like that. And it's not. And they want to change it to that. That makes them revolutionary liberals, not conservatives. So here you go. I think it's worth looking at that and considering that as a thing. So just look at this political spectrum. Conservative, the opposite to a revolutionary is a conservative. You could call a conservative a counter-revolutionary. They want things to stay the way they are. They want to stay within their box. They're comfortable where they are. Revolutionaries want to get out of the box. They want to go somewhere else. They want to do something new, right? People confuse that with conservative and liberal. They think liberals want to change things. Liberals don't want to change things. If you live in a liberal-free country, liberals don't want to change it. They want to stay there, right? In that case, a liberal would be a conservative. So here's the issue. Liberals right now in the United States aren't conservatives, right? They want their country to go towards liberalism because it's gone away from liberalism for quite some time. So there you go. Conservatives and revolutionaries are the two opposing sides of that axis of political motivation. Liberals and socialists are the opposites, the collectivists on one side and the individualists on the other. And so that's, if you understand that those are driven predominantly by personality trait. Dr. Peterson should understand this. He did a lot of the research on figuring this stuff out. But there you go. That's probably, I found a political spectrum that looked much like that when I was in staff college, written by might have been a French commentator in the early 1800s. That's right. He'd been reading Madison and Jefferson and John Locke and whatever. And those guys understood human personality pretty well. They may not have put the same technical definitions on it as Jordan Peterson might these days. But that is a very old idea, that spectrum that you're looking at right there. It is the idea articulated if you read the rest of that page, articulated by Jefferson and Madison. And Lincoln. Lincoln understood that as being the actual political spectrum. He understood the differences and the nuances between political motivations. So there you go. That's just my thing. I'd like to, just get people to think about that for a bit and recognize the fact that, much as I like Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray, they're not perfect either, but I really disagree with them on this. I'm not saying that there haven't been crazy things said by Trump. Don't get me wrong. I'm not disagreeing with that bit. What I'm saying is, if you think that the conservatives are the people voting for Trump, you're dead wrong. The people voting for Trump are the opposite of conservative. They are revolutionaries. They don't like where the United States is. They want to change the United States. They want it to have a smaller government. They want government out of their hair. They want government overreach gone. And over the last year, they've been proven right. We've watched government overreach take over the entire Western world and much of the developing world, adopting fundamentally medieval practices to try and stop a virus. And if you read that article by Jeffrey Tucker, it's all been for naught. It's failed dramatically. Why? Because the science knew up until 2019 that non-pharmaceutical interventions were total nonsense. They're anti-scientific medieval nonsense, right? But people have tried them all anyway. Why? Because there's this big government collectivist nonsense going on. It is an utter failure everywhere it's been tried in all of human history. All it has led to is suffering and destruction, right? And not just of humans, of the environment. And it's utterly destructive. It needs to be dealt with. It needs to be thrown back in the ash can of history where it belongs. But here's the thing. While we're discussing these things, Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, you need to look at Jordan Peterson's own research. Those people voting for Trump, not conservative at all, right? They're liberal in their instincts, predominantly liberal, and they are revolutionary. They don't want things to stay the way they are. And they want to break things, they want to break the system, and they want to change it to something else. The people who are conservative in the United States right now are socialist. They believe in big society. They believe in Big Brother looking after everybody. It's a very much top-down, society-driven, neo-fascist plutocracy. And they want it to stay that way. They want it to get bigger. They want that collectivist orthodoxy to dominate American society. They are conservative. From a personality sense, those are the conservatives. So that might be confusing to people, but have a read of that page. Have a read of my webpage there. I'll just remind everybody what it is. I'll just take you back to it here. Right? It is realcanadianliberal.ca. What is the political spectrum? You can find it in articles. It's a little right about there. So it's the fourth one down on the articles bar, right? And it goes through, traditional understanding of the political spectrum, where it comes from, why it's taught the way it's taught right now by a bunch of leftists, let's be honest, who favor the French side of the Enlightenment, which brought us, amongst other things, mass guillotine killings and Marxist revolution that then went and killed millions of people, and the Nazis who killed millions of people. Anyway, and then a discussion of what the actual political spectrum is. And it ties in things like personality traits and everything else. Threat of infectious disease, for example. Dr. Peterson should understand that. Pushes people towards what he describes as conservatism, but it's not. It's collectivism, tribalism, right? So what we're seeing right now, this pandemic, it's killing a million people. Well, actually, it's not. It's compared to preventable heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, it's not even significant. It's politics, is what it is, and every effort that all these interventionist governments have taken to try and change it have failed, because they're on this side over here. They're doing it because they believe in the ideology. The ideology of collectivism and intervention. It has nothing to do with science. And there's a lot of people out there, a lot of liberal people out there, who are getting very, very upset with the way the world's gone. And those are the people who created Donald Trump. And if we're not careful, they're going to create something a whole lot more robust, let's put it that way, than Donald Trump. So I'd just like everyone to take the time to think about that carefully and consider how they might respond or think about that, because I'm a liberal and I'm not happy with the way the world's gone. I fundamentally opposed to anti-scientific medieval superstition combined with collectivism and identity politics taking over the country that I love, here in Canada. And I'm fundamentally opposed to the same thing taking over the United States to the south, or the United Kingdom, or Germany, or France, right? France, the birthplace of liberty. Okay, may have had their problems too, but you know what? They appreciate individual liberty, or some of them do, half the population. I have no desire to see them go down this collectivist, fascist, corporatist line. And misunderstanding when we're in a conversation, even for Douglas Murray and Dr. Peterson, misunderstanding what the motivations are behind the movements that we're looking at is a good way of getting yourself on the very much on the wrong end of the stick. So there you go. A little bit of a different discussion for you. Please read that page. If you want to comment on it, feel free to. This will go up on YouTube, Rumble. It'll also go on my locals.com site. If you want to get into more in-depth discussion, I'll try and pay more attention to the locals site, but predominantly it's going to be Rumble, and that's just because Rumble is a less idiotic platform than YouTube. But anyway, they'll be on both. And but have a think about it. It's some challenging thoughts there, and have a look at that website. Have a look at the science. Have a look at the references. Have a look at the history behind it. Yeah, I think both Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray have got it wrong there, and I think they do well to spend a bit of time considering that if they change the way they look at that issue, it might give them a bit more insight into where it might go and what might be the way out of the craziness that we're in. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for showing up and listening to this one, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, have a good night.